I've been asked to tell you what I heard this morning. And so what I've done is throughout these presentations, I just took some notes. The things that stuck out to me and what I'll give you over the next few minutes here is what I felt like those highlights were, the thing that resonated with me and maybe what they mean to me as best I can articulate that. So let's go to the beginning. We started off here this morning with Dean Flores, and what we heard from him was that, and I was on faculty here for 12 years, but we heard a significant and well-articulated dedication to the beef industry at New Mexico State University. And also, just to follow that up, think about this. Dina Reitzel spoke to us, but she's not only been the exec for the Beef Council here in New Mexico for a number of years, she also serves on the Board of Regents. Is there any other Beef Council exec in the country that serves on the Board of Regents for a university? And that's great to have that type of influence at that level so that there is the support for the faculty that support the industry that we love so much. And I think that's a great thing, and we ought to look to New Mexico favorably for that in itself. The first presentation this morning that Rory gave us, man, really insightful. Sustainability, rhetoric versus reality. Here are some of the things that he mentioned. It was a quote, not of his, of someone else's. Meat is murder. The term rewilding, and we've heard those things before, but the question is what do we do about those? And as he mentioned, we've got to get ahead of that rhetoric. We've got to be an industry that's in front of the issues before they get to us, and that's really hard to do because we end up playing defense so much. One of the other things is essentially ruminants can equal climate change. And where was that coming from that presentation? Well, there was an example of a venture capitalist, a very wealthy man that has influence in a lot of businesses, but we've got to be mindful that since there is a belief that ruminants equal climate change in a negative sense, could we be used as a scapegoat? And how do we defend that? And I know the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef is thinking about things like this and trying to get in front of these things, so we ought to be appreciative of that. Some of the realities. Beef demand remains strong, and that's a good thing worldwide. But inflation is affecting us on the cost side of that equation worldwide too. That's a challenge. We've got these volatility issues. The events, we've had so many black swan events that I don't even know if we need to find another term that fits, but the viruses, the war, the things that we can't really predict. But the reality is volatility is part of today, and it will continue to be part of tomorrow. How do we respond to that? The biggest issue, 18% of emissions from deforestation is the driver, and that was deforestation in South America. He also later said that Brazil is becoming more efficient, and so that's good in their beef production systems. North America is not the problem. Our emissions intensity is very favorable, but that doesn't mean we can't be part of the solution. And for our global beef production and for our world, we ought to be. That was a takeaway as well. Climate changing activities, or let me talk about first the commitments that have been made. These are some commitments in 2030. Several countries made commitments towards reducing emissions and or towards carbon neutrality. Australia, New Zealand, Europe, Canada, the United States. Nature positive production. That's a term we're going to continue to hear more in the future. We need to be able to know what that means. And just like Decky was telling us a moment ago, not only do we need to know more about what that means, we need to be able to articulate it well to all that will listen so that we can demonstrate the great things that we do in this industry. Grazing, feed manipulation, animal welfare and health, genetics, all facets of our production system can have an impact on our climate, on our globe, on the sustainability of beef production. We need to be thinking about those. We can't change them all necessarily at once, but we need to be thinking about those. And if we're invested, bought into continuous improvement for our industry. He also said consumers want to eat beef, but they want reassurance that it's okay. I think he was quoting some statements out of Australia or New Zealand. But Rory mentioned that, and that struck me. It's not that people don't want beef, it's the doubt that's creeping in. And how do we get in front of that doubt really, really well? That's an issue that will always face our industry, and we've got to figure out how to get really good at that. It's not in our nature to communicate the great things that we do. That's not who we are as a ranching or an agriculture culture, but we've got to figure that one out. The roundtable is part of that solution, we hope and we believe. Global roundtables for sustainable beef, the Sustainable Beef Network across our globe, they're all working on our behalf. And that's a good thing. You know, this issue started several years ago, and we started hearing more and more about sustainability, and these groups came together for the success of the industry. And so we need to do whatever we can, I think, as an industry to empower those that are working for the industry. The next presentation, Dr. John Crawley, fitting environmental impacts into economic selection indexes. That one really made me think too. Improving production efficiency through genetic advancement is a lower cost approach to reducing greenhouse gases. He talked about gross emissions versus emissions intensity. And it wasn't that by just reducing cows, yes, reducing cows, you would reduce methane emissions from cows. That is an approach that was described. Another approach that was described was how we make the emissions intensity more favorable. That's about production efficiency, more pounds of product with less global warming impact from that product, whether it's neutral or whether it's negative, neutral, or positive global warming, reducing the impact per unit of product that's sold. In North America, we have a very good relative emissions intensity. It's a function of being the most efficient production system in the world. We have an advantage there for those of you in the United States. But I think there was something really important that you may or may not have missed that he mentioned in there. Because if we by reducing gross emissions, reduce the cow numbers from the United States, that doesn't change global beef demand. All that does is means the United States produces and supplies less of it. If that global beef demand is met by another country that isn't as efficient as we are, then what happens to the methane or the global warming, the intensity of emissions? Well, there's not a net gain for our world. It's actually potentially negative because that beef production is filled by production systems that are less efficient, not as favorable emissions intensity. I think that's really important to think about, because if we divest in the U.S. beef production in the name of global warming and it's fulfilled by some other part of the world, have we really made our world better? No, we provided opportunities for someone else to have that has a less efficient production system if we look at this strictly through the lens of emissions intensity and global warming potential. So think about that when you hear the discussions of just reducing cow numbers to change global warming potential. Then what do we need to do about that? And you saw the slide about breeding and the environment. And there was a list of 5 items in there. One of the things was continue with our current efforts, meaning this industry, before we talked about sustainability, was investing heavily in improvements in performance and efficiencies. And that is part of why our emissions intensity is low, as I interpreted from the statements that were made. Continue with that. I also heard that new selection criteria, in particular, age at slaughter, could be beneficial. New selection index weightings to emphasize more carbon positive traits, those like growth rate, to improve the emissions intensity. Novel traits like methane yield. Who would have thought at a BIF meeting in, let's say, the year 2020, or excuse me, 2000, that we would have been talking about EPDs associated with methane? And that's where we would be as an industry, thinking about that as one of the most important things that we need to be concerned with going forward? I don't think that anybody in this room would have said that that was going to be a topic of discussion in 2022, but it is today. And so that's something that we're probably going to hear more discussions about and will be more efforts towards the genetic impacts on methane production and how we could potentially change that to reduce emissions intensity more or to improve them. And the last thing that I took from that is if we know the carbon cost or the impact of carbon for each unit of a trait that we could measure, then we can create a carbon index like the economic indices. And the question is going to be, what's the value of a ton of carbon going to be in the future and the impact of those indices? We know it's part of our future. Those of you in this room are going to be carving out and charting the course for how we measure that for our industry in the future, but it's going to be a big thing that we need to pay attention to and see if we can learn more about. Next presentation by Dr. Sawyer. Towards climate neutral beef, are there viable paths? You know, it's interesting, and Dr. Sawyer and some others in our group have been working on an article about the divestiture in the beef industry, like you've seen or heard of with the oil and gas industry. And he showed some of those actions taken by money managers. And if you notice the increase in the concern and the investments associated with the sustainability of natural resources and agricultural management, it increased by 81% over that period of time. And I don't recall the period of time that it was over, but it was the highest one on the list. The money managers are telling us the social interest, what people are investing in. And that should be a little bit alarming to us and just highlight why this is such an important industry or issue for our industry to take action towards, where we're going to stand in terms of sustainability and how it will be perceived socially. He talked about climate neutral versus carbon neutral. Climate neutral is about removing warming equivalents more than are admitted, warming equivalents, whereas carbon neutral is about removing carbon from the atmosphere, more carbon than is emitted. We'll keep those terms straight. Another thing, and I hope that you knew by now because there's been a lot of discussion about it in the last couple of years, but the way that carbon and global warming potential had been measured in the past did not account for the life of carbon. It doesn't exist forever. Let me give you an analogy towards that I was thinking about when he was talking about this. So if carbon only lasts in the environment for 8 to 12 years, and he says more recently, 8.4 years is the estimate. So if we're going to talk about the carbon that comes from cattle production in some way, do we count all the carbon that they ever produced since the beginning of time? It's like saying, is the world population that of those that are alive today or those that have been born ever until this point in time? So that's the difference in GWP 100 and GWP star, the GWP star, global warming potential, that accounts for the lifespan of carbon in the environment. It's not the same math. It's more accurate if we look at it and consider that carbon doesn't stay in the atmosphere forever, 8 to 12 years. That's very important when we think about the story that people socially hear about cows and methane and global warming. That original story that they started to hear was not about, oh yeah, but the methane doesn't last in the environment for a few years. It's about the accumulation of methane as if it stacked up over time and never went away. We need to be aware of that when we have those discussions with people that are interested in our industry. Another thing he showed, and I was just looking at one of these slides, compared to the early 1980s, if you looked at the projection out to 2050, compared to the early 1980s, the U.S. warming equivalent from cattle was about half of that from around 1982 or 1983. That's pretty important. A 1.5% decrease in methane emissions gets this industry in North America towards climate neutrality by 2037. That's only 1.5%. I don't think that our country believes that, our world believes that we might even be climate neutral now, depending on how you do that math. We need to tell that story. He also said, with a modest increase in carbon sequestration per acre, plus a modest decrease of even 0.4% in methane's emissions, we approach that climate neutrality very quickly. A lot of interesting numbers, a lot of interesting data. And so what does that mean for us? You're going to hear more talks throughout this convention about some of these particular issues, a little bit more detail. I know that many of you, when you leave here to go back to your operations that you will manage, you're probably going to hear some stuff that you'll be thinking about, you'll be chewing upon. I think as we listen to these three larger scale operations talk about how thoughtful they have been in their operations, about how they're interacting with the public, about what they're doing with their natural resources, how they're taking care of their animals. Those are the stories we want to get out, and we want to make sure that those authentic stories are heard. So as an industry, one of my takeaways from this morning, and maybe the biggest one, is the whole idea of telling our story. As we've talked about this for years and years, but how are we going to invest at a threshold that's high enough that we turn that tide so that we're truly out in front, so that our authentic story is one that's received and understood and believed by those people that buy our products? Because if you looked at that diagram that looked a little bit like a spaghetti bowl that Dr. Sawyer put up on the screen, if you went from economic viability backwards to the factors that drove that, part of it was cost of production, part of it was the revenue side, it was the price. And what was the biggest driver of price received? Consumer trust. And consumer trust is a function of social acceptance of what we do. And I don't think we can get around that. But I think as an industry, we have to continue to think boldly forward about how we move the needle at a threshold level to be able to change that tide so that we are authentically getting our story across.